Right. I wanted to share some thoughts on the birth of orthodoxy and institutionalization because we were we got discussing in our Patreon meetup. Oh, by the way, those of you that do want to sign up to that, just go to Patreon and it gives you different tiers and you can connect. I did make a post. In fact, I'll make a separate statement about this at the end about people when they want to connect and they want, because it's difficult, on these other social media, you can't really give that time. Um, so you have that option in Patreon. You can have one-to-one discussions. You can book yourself in. Okay, now look, on our Patreon meetup, we got chatting on the group meetup, and we were just talking, and we ended up speaking about these issues. And then one of them did say that, have you discussed this in your meeting with Malm? And I did say, look, you know what? I'll do it again, inshallah. I'm sure I have in the past, but I'll kind of expand on this slightly. So orthodoxy, that there's it's I think it's very interesting to kind of examine orthodoxy. So orthodoxy is, well, people would understand it as saying, well, it's the correct belief, but it's not just the correct belief. It's like saying the belief that has been deemed correct. Okay. Now, that's interesting because when you say, well, deemed correct, institutions come into play and power comes into play. So it's very fascinating. Like, this was the phenomenon we were discussing. When we look at Sunni Islam, we find that for the first almost 200 years, there clearly is the main body of Muslims, the main, what you call the Sawadul A'zam, the great, the main body of people who were main Muslims, but they didn't have a name. So this name, Ahl Sunnah, didn't exist for until over, decades over 200 years after the Prophet. So there was no name for the main body of Muslims. So if you said to someone, well, who are you? They would just say, we're Muslim. But there were many other sects that had emerged. So the Shia had emerged, the Khawarij had emerged, the Qadariya, the Jabariya, let's say the Rawafid, the different sects had emerged. So how did you identify as I'm from the main body of Muslims? So what you had was there was an identitarian methodology that took place, and that was that by association. So, and one symbol of that was that you were engaged in the study of and the study and the project of hadith. So, if you were engaged in the hadith project as a muhaddith of Islam, you by default were at the center because the hadith represented the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even though hadith is not synonymous with sunnah in especially in Maliki and Hanafi Islam, the majority of Sunni Islam, because they're the majority in numbers, but hadith still is an attempt to capture the historical records of the Prophet. So if you're somebody engaged in that, you are in the center. This is one way of saying I'm. Uh, Obviously the word Sunni didn't exist, but it's like saying I'm a proto-Sunni. I'm from the main body of Muslims. I'm not from a deviant sect. Okay. This is why, for example, Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, was one of the greatest scholars of Islam. He wasn't bulletproof. You see, because if you were involved in the Hadith project, that was one layer of armor against this being ostracized. So he wasn't, because he was not involved in the Hadith project, and hence he was a target, and hence he was cast aside from the main body of Muslims, according to certain scholars of the time. They considered him a deviant because he wasn't from the Hadith project. So, because if you think of it, Imam Abu Hanifa, who was involved in reason and he used logic and reason, voice of reason to, and and compassion as a key tool to instrumentalize the Sharia. His views, which are Imam Malik holds many similar, if not some more outstretched views. But why was Imam Malik never cast aside or ostracized? Because he was Amir al-Mu'mineen fil Hadith. He was not only well involved in the Hadith project, he was a don of the sciences of Hadith. So, in many ways, he was then untouchable. So, okay, so you've got this. The other way that people had this understanding for at least the first 200 years of Islam was they identified the in group by it's an apophatic. It's by an apophatic methodology. You know what? Let me bring this up. Right, right. So, yeah, apophatic. That's it. Yeah. So, apophatic methodology. It's by what you negating by what you're not. So, so the center is defined by the periphery. So the periphery, the edges define where the center is. So if you're standing at the edge, then and I'm not there, I know I'm not at the edge, and by contrast, I must be closer to the center. So, for example, we would say we are the main body of Muslims because we are not people who, let's say, the Shia who believe in imamship. We are not people who call Muslims non-Muslim by committing a major sin, the Khawarij. We are not people. So you're not saying what you are, you simply state what you are not. An apophatic methodology. So you just state the negative, and so you define the in-group by contrasting it to an out group. You don't give a definition for the in group. You just say we are not that group. So this is how, and that's a very interesting phenomenon because the question is, well, why didn't somebody give a definition for the in group? And they don't. So Imam Malik's Fatawa, look at his Mudawwana, he's answering over 30,000 masail. Abu Hanifa's Zahir or Riwaya, 100,000 masail, but they never explain aqidah. Never. They never tell you what you need to believe. They do discuss the Imam Malik says he mentions Shia in his Mudawwana. He mentions Khawarij, Kharijis. He mentions Qadaris. He mentions Mu'tazila. He mentions, but he never tells you what you believe to be. There is no checklist to believe. There is only the in group is identified in contrast to the outgroup. So as long as you don't do these things, let's say you don't curse the companions, you don't do takfir of Muslims, you don't, then you're fine. You're within the main body of Muslims. Now that is vast because it's still not, there's no inquisition into what you actually believe. And that is how the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was. Because the sunnah of the Prophet was not to go around and say, what do you believe about this? How do you believe this? Oh, you don't believe that? Chuck him out. What do you believe about this? It wasn't. It was, look, as long as you don't worship other idols, you don't do this, you don't do this, you believe in Allah, you accept the message. So when these few criteria they did have, but they didn't used to mention because it's so obvious, it's so commonplace that amantu billah, I believe in Allah, I believe in revelation, malaikati, kutubihi, wa rusulihi, and messengers, wal yawmil akhir, I believe in a life after death, and I believe Allah is all powerful. Yeah, that of course that every child had, and that makes you a Muslim. So there was no definition there was no checklist. as long as you don't curse companions, as long as you don't curse the wives of the Prophet, as long as you don't do this, you're from the main body of Muslims. Now you may say, well, okay, but I understand this thing like this and this thing. Well, nobody is checking. Nobody's there to check that. This is your, and in this way, Iman is in its natural fitra state. So, and this is the lifetime of the Salaf. The Salaf are the Sahaba, the Tabi'in, Atba'u Tabi'in. That's it. In their lifetime, this is how Islam was. So in Imam Malik's lifetime, there was no such thing as to be a Sunni. You need this, apart from saying, I believe in Allah, in revelation, and the messengers and life after death. There was nothing like that. That they didn't even say because it was so obvious. Everybody, every Muslim accepted that. So that's just an obvious. So now what happens is after the 200s, decades into it, and it's disputable where does it originate. In my research, I feel this originates. The birth of this is with the Khalqul Quran mas'ala, the creation of the Quran mas'ala. That is the premise and the pretext which gives rise to the opportunity to now structuralize and forge orthodoxy. That we can now, because this mas'ala of khalqul Quran is the first mas'ala in which scholars take a stance. I mean, which, and by the way, there was no precedence in this because it doesn't really make sense that there were precedents. I know people tried to say there was precedence. It's it's really all fabricated. That this was a new mas'ala. Nobody was discussing this mas'ala before. This is why they struggled with it because if they didn't struggle, they would have just said, look, we're just following what everybody else believed. Why are you picking on us? The issue was there was no precedent in this masala. So, people try to say Imam Malik said this, that, oh, the Quran isn't created. All these things aren't made up. They didn't even discuss this. This was not even a discussion. It's like saying, Isaac Newton was discussing quantum physics. Look, he's got a quote saying quantum. That they weren't. Or here, uh, you know, Albert Einstein is discussing the iPhone and he's got, the iPhone 13, he's got a comment on it. That's fabricated. That didn't happen at that time. They weren't discussing these things. So with this debate, scholars took a stance. Now, that's a different debate in itself, and no point really getting into that debate. But the point was that the first discussion began because when the scholars said that, oh, the Quran is not created, the, the counter question was, well, okay, so is it God? And you see, they kind of found themselves between a rock and a hard place because, well, it's not. Well, it is God, like it's the speech of God. Saying, okay, well, is the speech of God God? And then this gets confusing because you're like, well, what do I say to that? And so they said, well, right. So they didn't know where to put it because if you say it's not God, then it's created. If you say it is God, but it's not him, then it's with him. Then you've got God and another piece of God thing that is with God. So you've got two gods. So this is philosophically, you're in a wrench. So to get round this, the ulama, they came up with, oh, well, it's an attribute of God. It's a sifa. This is the birth of sifat, by the way. So nobody prior to that had ever used these words in this sense. And I know some people try to justify it, but really it's, okay, you can try to justify it, but if you're going to call a spade and just be honest, you're going to know that the birth of this issue is with the Khalqul Quran. That they didn't know where to put this now. So they said, well, oh, this is okay, let's call it an attribute of God. So theology starts to get formed. It is the birth of orthodoxy, that we, as the main body of Muslims, are people who believe, who affirm. Remember, first it was we negate. We don't curse the companions. We don't do this. We don't. Now it's we affirm, we believe there's a checklist that the Quran is not created. If you tick this, you are now in, you are with the in group. So it became a to do, like there's a criteria, a checklist. So this is why you see, so for example, the greatest Sunni scholars, theologians like Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, who's the father of Ahl Sunnah. I know people say Imam Ahmad is the father of Ahl Sunnah. That's a different discussion. But really, from what I've, my people, if they have any evidence to the contrary, but what I've come across in my readings is that the first person to use the word Ahl Sunnah was Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari. And this is way into the 200 Hijri, because Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari is originally from the Mu'tazila. He's not even from Sunni Islam originally. He is the nephew of Abu Ali al-Jabba'i, who is a major figure in the Mu'tazila legacy, great thinker of Mu'tazila, denomination, sect. Now, Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari breaks away from him, and he then starts to amend certain beliefs, because they have, remember, mainstream Muslims don't have a checklist of what makes you the in group. They just know we are not the out group. It starts in that century. Then people start adding to this list. Then, okay, we are people who affirm that the Quran is not created, tick. Then people add another thing. Okay, we are people who affirm this, another thing. Before the end of the century, you've got Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, Imam Tahawi, the great Hanafi scholar. In his Aqidah Tahawiyah, you've got over 160, 164, 165 things on his checklist now. That if you don't even believe in one of these, you are out. See, first, you go back 100 years. If you don't curse the companions and you don't curse this, you are in. The, 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 the periphery defines the center. That if you're not on the edge, you're in the center. And the center is fluid. There's an amorphosity. There is this kind of like, it's a flow structure. Okay, it's in free flow, but this is how Iman was taught by the Prophet ﷺ. It wasn't a checklist. It was just taught. And the living tradition was you just learn it. And so considering, look, people like Imam Malik, they writing at length, I mean, volumes, Mudawwanatul al-Kubra, 35,000, 36,000 masail. They're arguing about things like, if you use a nail in the wall of a neighbor, what do you do? What's the compensation for this? If you build a wall around here, if you tie your horse over there, if you bring 8 bags of wheat and do this, if you translate this into this, why are they not mentioning Aqidah? What do you actually believe in to be a Muslim? They don't do it. And there is wisdom with the Salaf. There is wisdom. Now, you see, you fast forward 100 years and now you have a checklist. Now we can measure you against the list. If you don't meet up to one of these things, we will chuck you out. See, now that also, you see, the question is, if you go back 100 years, that had an amorphosity. It was amorphous. It was like, didn't have a set structure. It's like a floating cloud. Okay. Now you fast forward 100 years and people could argue, well, there's a crystallinity. Where you have a substance that's amorphous, and then the crystallinity of it, the crystalline structure, is it's so, the carbons are so tightly packed together, they're all structured. So people may say, well, okay, there's this crystallinity to it now. But the thing is, there's also power. Because you see, if I'm in the in group and I don't want you in the in group, then I add on another checklist, because now people are adding. Everybody, once you've started it's now people they can keep adding. Well, okay, to be a Sunni Muslim, you also need this now. Anybody who does or to be a Sunni Muslim, you can never do this now. So it's interesting now, and people keep adding. And the adding, maybe they're doing it genuinely. I'm not saying they're disingenuous, but what you can't take away is the human boundedness with power structures. That when insan is in a position of power and you are arguing against, there is always an element of, you see, you're what you're embedding in the structure. So, for example, let's say I'll give you an example. Well, okay, not to expand too much, but let's take a very brief look at the concept of ijma. Now, this is not to debate the issue of ijma, and that can be for another day, but let's say this is a tool that scholars have, that they say, well, this is the consensus, and consensus is uh it's a card that holds weight. Like, let's say, not to say it's a game, but let's say, if we're using that analogy, we can use this to show that, look, why are we doing this? Because we have ijma. Okay. But the question, when you look at Imam Shafi'i's time, when they're trying to discuss what are the tools to make Sharia, they say, well, okay, the tools to make Sharia are have to be proven from the Quran and Sunnah. So basically, either the Quran teaches you or the Prophet taught you. But the Prophet never taught ijma, because that wouldn't make sense. So the Prophet never taught ijma. That's clear. So you could say, well, but the scholars, they deduce this, or sorry, they induced this principle by looking at different things. So they looked at things and they came out with this principle, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And okay, that's great. So the scholars came up with this for a preservation method. Sure. Now, did some scholars ever question this? Of course they did. Like Ibn Hazm, for example, questions it. Other people question it. What type of ijma? Who's ijma? Ijma of the Sahaba, ijma of Medina, ijma of the family of the Prophet, ijma of all Muslims, ijma of the ijma of the jinn, ijma of just, there's all kinds of, there may be absurd questions, but people say ijma of who? So, okay, now, you see, so this is a tool that the scholars, they by inductive reasoning, they kind of arrived at these. Now, you see, well, somebody may say, well, I don't know, I'm not so convinced. So this is now on the checklist. Okay, anybody who doesn't accept this is no longer part of the main body of Muslims. We just add it on. So it becomes like, well, okay, well, now I can't question that. It's a bit like the cancel culture, which is also about power. See, like, if you look at the mega wokeism today, and it's going mad. I just saw a clip today with some senator, and some woman was discussing something, and they're discussing the term about, I think, pregnancy, and they say, and she's asking him that, oh, do you? And I think he's asking her something about, well, you're saying uh, persons or people capable of pregnancy. And so he says, I thought this issue was a women's issue. Are we not discussing women's rights? And she says, well, it doesn't, it's not just to women. Obviously women get pregnant, some women don't get pregnant, some, let's say, trans people, some men, some non-binary, some pan-binary, whatever. She mentions all these things. So she says, well, all of these categories uh, are capable of pregnancy. So she says, "Do you?" So he says, "I don't understand. Like, I thought." So she says, "Oh, don't you? Do you not believe that men can get pregnant?" So he says, "No." And so she says, "Oh, so you, by that very comment, are inciting violence against uh, uh transsexual, you're transphobic, and violence against these people." And he says, well, where am I doing that? I'm just asking. He says, I just said, no, I didn't know that. And and it's and this is, so that's a whole different discussion. And what's actually really interesting on all of this stuff, on a side note, is people keep bringing, it's like Dave Chappelle said, people keep bringing up these things, and they bring up transphobic, but really the trans community themselves are usually not, that they're usually very fine and very understanding of this, and they're not the people causing this kind of commotion. They're not at all. In fact, Dave Chappelle on one of his things says, "Look, I get so many letters from the trans community saying, look, man, we've I don't know who these people, but they're not speaking on behalf of us." So that's a different discussion in and of itself. That why. So, but the point is, this cancel culture, it becomes another add-on thing because there's power involved. So, oh, if you don't do that, you're automatically out of the in-group. So this is really fascinating, that how the birth of orthodoxy takes place. This is a very academic discussion. So it's very separate from um, a kind of confessional learning of Islam, and even and very separate from a devotional attitude of practicing Islam. This is a very academic, ilmi pursuit, that how orthodoxy was born, and you can't always separate the power structures from, even if people, you see, because it's naive to assume that only people that are disingenuous act from power. That's incredibly, that's totally not true. Everybody acts from power, and it doesn't mean you're disingenuous. It just has to add an element of neutrality to it. That's all. So, and a good example is like this. Like, let's say we wanted to, and this is going to go into another discussion. Let's say we wanted to discuss dispensations in Islam, like things that you're allowed to do. Let's say by default, let's say you had to do wudu, but you don't need to do wudu because you're ill, or so you can do tayammum, or there's something, you got an injury, or there's something. Now, you see, or it could be something else. Let's say you need to shorten the prayer, or there's something totally different. You needed to, whatever it was, whatever the thing, but you needed a rukhsa. Now, the question is, well, you see, language. When I say to you that, oh, this is, like, oh, that's an inconvenience to do. You see, language is loaded. So imagine I said, well, wudu must be done and cannot be substituted by tayammum simply by inconvenience. Oh, so this is a clear Hanafi style. I know the Malikis are much more relaxed on substituting wudu with tayammum, but let's say the Hanafis are very strict. So they say, well, wudu cannot be substituted by tayammum by simply inconvenience. So you see, but the question here is that when you say inconvenience, you've already rigged the game, because inconvenience is already a subjective opinion. So now I say, well, what's an inconvenience? Okay, so there may be some very trivial things that maybe people agree on, but it's a subjective. So one person's inconvenience may be another person's nightmare. Maybe. Let's say a person has a cold. This is a nightmare. I'm not doing wudu. So, well, that's just a little inconvenience. The other person, this is a catastrophe. I can't work. I can't do this. Or you see, the moment we deploy words, like the moment we deploy words, we are agents of power. We select words, maybe subconsciously, but we embed power structures by the use of words. So when I say, so imagine I didn't say that now. Like, imagine the Malikiya were writing the same thing. So let's say the Hanafi was writing this, and they said, well, wudu cannot be substituted by tayammum because of simple inconveniences. Now let's say i.e. a cold. Let's say the Malikis were writing that. We say, well, wudu can be substituted by tayammum due to hardships, i.e. a cold. The power of the word. See, you embed a power structure, the game is rigged. You see, because you already define the outcome. So this is the issue with, and you could do this genuinely. You could do this, mukhlisina lillahi din. You could be mukhlis, but you are embedding power elements in the equation the moment you speak, the moment you said something. So when people become a the so the strength of having an orthodoxy was people were saying, well, we've got structure now. First we had this amorphosity, we don't know what did they believe, I don't know, they what did the tabi'in exactly believe about certain things, we just don't know, they never spoke about it. Okay, that's all nebulous, and it's kind of free floating. Let's have some structure so we can tell our children exactly. You don't just say be part of the main body, we could tell them exactly. So this is the plus side, why people went for it. That we can be clear, we can have clarity. It's not just a free floating, it's a solid foundation now. Okay. And it is, let's be honest. It's much more clearer than trying to say, well, just believe. But then the problem, you see, well, okay, what is it that they believe? Because remember, this list hasn't been taught to you by Allah and His Messenger. It's been taught by men, righteous men, inshallah. But the thing is, they're still men, and they still spoke with a perspective that unquestionably was nested in an agency of control from where they stood. So if they were an Ash'ari, they were writing from an Ash'ari perspective. If they were Hanbali, they were writing from a Hanbali perspective. If they were the clergy and they don't want you to question certain things, they put that in there, because sure, they may do it for a good reason, because we just don't want people arguing with us. It wastes our time. We're doing it to save valuable Muslim time. They may be very sincere, but you see, it becomes a power structure that's embedded. Now you see, you don't meet up to this list, there's an inquisition. You see, if you don't meet up, chuck them out. So it's really fascinating, just as an anthropological analysis of where all of this originates in our history. We have to kind of sift through it and filter through it and think, wow, okay, I wonder where this came from. Where did this originate? So in my research, a lot of it originates around the inquisition of the Mahna of the Quran, the creation of the Quran. Although I don't think people before that hadn't thought of it. I think it's very naive to assume that these scholars who were writing thousands and thousands of fatwa didn't think of, let's have a creed. I mean, that's like common sense 101. So why didn't they do it though? See, that's the question. That's the $1 million question. Why did they not do it? There could be a PhD on that. There could be a PhD on all of these things that I've said, on the birth of orthodoxy, or whether it's going to be the definitions of orthodoxy and how that's played out in Islam, or whether it's going to be the first 200 years of Islam, why there was no um, um, crystalline orthodoxy, and why not? Because they must have had their reasons. And I'm not saying, and their reasons could have been ironically a lack of power to do it, you see. So wow, wow, fascinating. So okay, let's go on, people. You know what, let me share the link and let's get some chats, and what we'll do is then we can call this a wrap.